This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're talking all about Mikko Kokkonen, who's coming off of a bit of a resurgent season last year with the Toronto Marlies. Kokkonen was drafted 84th overall in the third round by the Maple Leafs back in 2019. He's already going into his sixth season as a Maple Leafs prospect. Now, not all of those years were spent in the Leafs organization. He spent 3 seasons after his draft still in Finland with Jukurit and then in the Pelican system before coming over to the Marlies full-time in 2022. Now, before we dive into how things have gone for Kokkonen this year, I think it's important to kind of talk about his path in the Leafs organization. Back when he was drafted, he was somebody that was an intriguing prospect because of him playing at the professional level as a 18-year-old defenseman. Put up 19 points in 56 games with Jukurit in his draft year and had played pro games the previous year as well. In fact, Kokkonen is the youngest player in Finnish league history. He made his debut at 15 years old back in 2016-17 with Jukurit. So he'd been playing in the professional ranks for a couple of seasons already going into his draft. But for whatever reason, the lack of perceived offensive upside, or maybe the lack of size, because he's a pretty average sized defenseman at 6 foot, roughly 200 pounds, some of those factors knocked him down the board despite being defensively mature enough to play 2 full pro seasons, essentially, at 17, 18 years old going into his draft. So at the time, in a Leafs system that was swinging on a lot of upside at the time, you think back to 2019 and who the Leafs drafted, and you're talking about guys like Nick Robertson in the second round, Mikhail Abramov in the fourth round, Nick Abruzzese in the fourth round, even later round swings like a small undersized defenseman and Mike Kester, things like that. Kokkonen was a bit different from there because all those other players, their main traits were offense, and Kokkonen's main trait was defense and being defensively mature enough to play a full pro season in Liga at that time. And the hope was putting up almost 20 points in 56 games as an 18-year-old defenseman in Liga, that he would be able to build on that and become maybe a bit more rounded out offensively in addition to some good defense and become like a legit top 4 type defenseman, two-way defender. It never really panned out that way. He spent the next 2 seasons after that in Jukurit, who were a very up and down team in Liga. He played for the Finnish World Junior team in both of those seasons. Never really put up any numbers with that team. In those 2 seasons with Jukurit, his offensive production regressed, especially in that last season with Jukurit, where he only had 10 points in 50 games and was actually an alternate captain on that team, was a -17 rating on that team as well. Like a lot of up and down throughout that tenure. But the overall sentiment was still that he was a good defensively mature player and that coming over to North America, that might help his style. And well, at the end of the 2020-21 season, he came over to the Marlies for the first time, played 11 games in that weird kind of COVID schedule, and put up 7 points in that span. So when he does that, all of a sudden the hope becomes maybe it's just the team holding him back in Finland, or maybe the league holding him back and he has more to show. So at this point, man, my opinion of Kokkonen is going up and down, up and down. At one point, I have him inside my top 10 in my prospect rankings. Looking back at the history of what I've done for that, I had him at his highest at 8th in the summer of 2021, coming off of that stretch with the Marlies. And I've had him as low as outside the top 20 entirely at 23rd coming into this past season. So Kokkonen has very much been an up and down player for me, where I've appreciated the defensive game, but I haven't really seen enough from him to be a legitimate NHL projection. I started to see that a little bit with that kind of stint with the Marlies at the end of the season where he finally put up some offense. But looking back now, it seems like that was a bit more fluky, maybe just because of the competition or whatever it was. Think like Pavel Gogolev type thing in that season where he gets an NHL contract out of that and never really does anything after that season. So after that year, he goes back to Finland for one more season after signing his entry-level contract. He moves to Pelicans, a much better team in Liga, at least on paper. Doesn't really do much in that season as well, with 15 points in 58 games, plays like a top 4 role, plays left and right. But again, nothing that really gets you excited for him coming to North America. Comes to North America in 2022 and really underwhelms in that first full season with the Marlies. 6 points in 36 games with the Marlies, no goals, actually gets sent down to the Growlers at one point and has 3 points in 8 games there with the Newfoundland Growlers in the ECHL. It's a +5 in that span though, and ultimately ends the season back with the Growlers, playing for them in their postseason run. Plays 13 games there and starts to kind of find his game a little bit. 30 goals, 9 points in that span, a +3 rating, plays legit top 4 minutes on a playoff team in the ECHL playoffs. And at that point, the hope is that he's finding his game again, getting comfortable in North America, and he can become a full-time regular with the Marlies the next season. Well, if you remember last year in the preseason, Kokkonen was one of the standouts in preseason, getting a lot of praise from Sheldon Keefe, sticking around camp a lot longer than people expected. So going from finishing the season in literally the ECHL to making an impression on the NHL head coach that next training camp, that's a big jump to make. And last season with the Marlies, Kokkonen was legitimately a regular. 65 games, 5 goals, 19 points, significantly more offense, even if it isn't enough offense to really wow you or get you excited. It's enough offense to at least be a regular on an AHL defense group. So takes that big jump there, becomes a regular, plays left and right side as well, plays quite a bit with Max Lajoie over the course of the season, plays a little bit with some other guys as well, and is a legit top 4 guy at the end of the season into the playoffs. So coming into this year, there's a lot of competition on the Marlies projected roster. You look at additions like Cade Weber, Dakota Mermis, guys like Topi Niemela taking another jump, even other additions like Philippe Myers and Nick Mattinen projected to take spots on the right side, which is where Kokkonen primarily played last season as well. It's a lot of bodies to compete against. And the unfortunate reality for Kokkonen, at least in my opinion, is that he's 23. He's going to be turning 24 mid-season. I don't really see him pushing for an NHL gig, certainly not to start the season. And there's other guys that I just like more on the Marlies roster. The knock against Kokkonen has always been there's no like standout traits. Good defensively, not really great offensively, even if he's shown some flashes of a bit more offensive upside. He's not huge at 6 foot, 200 pounds, and he's an average skater kind of at best. And so you take that entire package, and it's a very kind of average projection to a third pair or depth defenseman. And you look at the other guys the Marlies have on the projected roster. Cade Weber, he's huge at 6'7", big shot blocker, penalty killer. Those attributes are going to be more appealing to an NHL roster or to a team in general than maybe a slightly more well-rounded player in Kokkonen, but doesn't give you the upside of the penalty killing shot blocking that Cade Weber does. Okay, we'll put that aside. Marshall Rafai, that's like the number one competition for him in terms of like a one-to-one type player. Rafai blows him out of the water in terms of his skating. Similar size, Rafai, there's some weird stuff with his size. Go listen to my episode on Rafai for a bit more about like the weird size stuff with him. But the main thing is that at least they're roughly the same size. Rafai has the significantly better skating, and I think that leads to better defensive projection in the NHL as well. He also has a bit more of a mean streak, certainly more of a mean streak, I should say, than Kokkonen. So that, in my opinion, pushes him higher than Kokkonen. So then that's already 2 guys in the organization that are ahead of Kokkonen in terms of having standout traits that I would look for in terms of guys to get NHL minutes over somebody like Kokkonen. And then you look on the right side, and it's a bit of a different mix if you're shifting Kokkonen to the right side, but you have NHL experience in Phil Myers, higher NHL projection in Topi Niemela, and a wild card in Nick Mattinen, and that's without including guys like William Villeneuve, and then the other depth defensemen like Matteo Petronero and other guys. So overall, there's some stuff to like with Kokkonen's game. I just haven't really seen enough of it in past years to really be excited about him, even after one standout season with the Marlies, or I should say resurgent season with the Marlies. So overall, Kokkonen is somebody that could push for an NHL debut this season, but isn't really somebody that I'm super excited about. That being said, there is somebody that likes his game and thinks that he's somebody that can push for NHL minutes, and that's Ryan Ma. And so I'm very excited to get to my conversation with Ryan, one of the up and comers in the kind of public scouting space, as somebody that still likes Kokkonen's game and somebody that has him as quote unquote one of his guys in the Leafs organization. A great chat with him, diving very in depth to Kokkonen's game, kind of his development over the past couple of years, and what we could see from Kokkonen this upcoming season. So let's get to that conversation now with Ryan Ma. Very excited to welcome on Ryan Ma to talk all about Mikko Kokkonen. Ryan, thanks for taking some time today.
Oh, thank you, Kyle, for having me. Been a huge fan of the work so far, so keep that up.
Thanks, man. So I think we should start off maybe with why Kokkonen is one of the guys you like. Typically start off by talking about some play style and stuff. But I think, first of all, I think it's important to kind of talk about why you like this player as much as you do. You put out some Leafs prospect ranking type stuff, and you had the top three category, but then you also had the your guys category, which I love. I'm all about the depth random guys that I consider my guys, and Kokkonen was one of those for you, even though he was a bit further down on the tier list. What stands out about Kokkonen that makes him quote unquote one of your guys?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I've always had a bit of a soft spot throughout the years of watching prospects with kind of more intelligent defensemen who play a really low event game and spend most of their efforts focusing on limiting dangerous scoring opportunities and just being really responsible on and off the puck, right? You think about some of the more recent this generation of Leafs teams, right? With the core four and Austin Matthews. And if you look at the blue line, I think by a wide margin, most people would agree that outside of Morgan Riley, that Jake Muzzin and TJ Brody would probably be the two next best guys that the Leafs have had in that room. And so it kind of proves that mindset, at least to me, that you don't need guys, bruisers, or guys who will hit everything that moves on your blue line to win, right? It doesn't have to be Quinn Hughes or Eric Branson. There's a bit of a happy medium that you can find. You can make it to the NHL with smarts and positioning and making the right play. And I think that's part of the reason why I was really high on a guy like Dominic Badinka as well in this most recent draft cycle. Obviously, Badinka has the really high-end skating and the physical traits that Kokkonen lacks, but I think part of it is also just rooting for the underdog. Right? That's kind of coming through for me. He was a guy that I really liked in his draft year. 2017 to 2020 was kind of the Finnish boom with a lot of like highly touted Finnish guys coming through, and I kind of jumped on that wave. And even though he doesn't have any super eye-popping traits that you would necessarily kind of associate with NHL level player, I think the great thing about Mikko Kokkonen is that he really maximizes what he does have, right? He can't grow a longer wingspan. He can't become 6'3" at this stage. He's 22, 23 years old. He's gonna be 6 feet, 200 pounds. That's what he's gonna be. But with that frame and profile and the skill set that he does have, I think he maximizes the impact that he can have on a game. And in general, I think it's tough not to root for that smart, scrappy, average-sized defenseman to kind of make it. And I guess one last thing is just that I don't think that he's as high on the Leafs depth chart with consensus as I think he should be. When you look through the Twitter atmosphere and you go on, you look at, Editor and Lee for all these different websites and blogs that post about the Leafs. You see a lot of Cade Weber. You see a lot of Nicholas Mattinen. Great video on that, by the way. And, Marshall Rafai, right? And maybe even Topi Niemela in terms of like those top guys that are probably going to start with the Marlies before they make that jump to the Leafs if injuries happen. And, it makes sense. I think especially with Weber and Mattinen, these are two guys that the new front office have brought in. And so they kind of, I think, have a bit more cachet with the front office than, a guy like Niemela or Kokkonen or even Rafai might have, as, those are Dubas holdovers. But I think I don't really hear anyone talking about Kokkonen with that group. And I think that he has qualities to his game that I really like that I think would serve him well in a depth role. I don't think he's ever going to be much more than that, but I think there's enough of a baseline there to be, a serviceable player in the NHL.
Yeah, and so let's before we get into kind of how his game has progressed the last couple of years, right now, what do you get when Mikko Kokkonen is stepping on the ice? What is his kind of his play style like?
Yeah, we're gonna I know we're gonna delve into it like really into detail over the course of this, so I'm gonna try to keep it a little bit more brief. But I think that when I look at Mikko Kokkonen, the big thing that comes to mind when describing his game is that he's one, really calm. Number two, he's really poised. And number three, he's really efficient, right? There's not a ton of times when he's retrieving a puck or he's defending an odd man rush where you really feel like he's panicked or flustered in any way. He's a really direct player. He connects point A and B together, and he rarely tries to get too fancy with it, right? And that's what I mean when I say he kind of understands his shortcomings and he plays his game with that in mind, right? Um, he's got a good motor. I think he works really hard. I love his stick checking. And he's got a bit of an edge to his game, right? Which, if you've ever been a part of Leafs Nation or been across the platform at any point in time, any defenseman who's, not afraid to give a cross check or, get in the face of an opposing player who gets too close to the goalie is a welcome sight. Simone Benoit got a 2-year extension off of doing literally that. And Kokanen's not going to be a guy who lights up players and hits them and gets into fights, but I think with this fan base in particular, any defenseman who's has a bit of an edge and is willing to get a little nasty with the cross checks, I think is a welcome sight for this fan base. So I think that's something that fans will love if they ever see him at the NHL level. Um, I wouldn't say he's a clunky skater, but he definitely looks very heavy in his stride, and it makes sense. He's 6 feet and 200 pounds, so he's not a burner by any means. I would say his calling cards would be his intelligence and his ability to kind of read the ice and make quick decisions. This past season, he was relied a lot with the Marlies in penalty kill situations and late game situations. I think he had like 5 or 6 of his total points of the year were all just assists or goals on empty nets. So obviously there's a trust there with the Marley staff. He's been stapled in, surprisingly this entire past season on the right side, basically with Max Lajoie. So there's some potential versatility there in his game where he can play his offside. And I think that's something that teams always value and appreciate. And it's a testament, I think, to that hockey IQ and those instincts that he has defensively, where he can play on an offside after a really rough first year in North America, and hold his own on top pair minutes in his second season in North America. So those are kind of the things that I really think about when I look at Mikko Kokkonen. Just a really efficient, smart player.
What were some of the things that you saw from this year where he was an AHL regular that were the key differences from that first year where he struggled?
Yeah, I think with this question, I kind of want to break it into 3 parts, which is kind of
Yeah,
his time in
totally.
Finland, and then his first year in North America, and then kind of what he's done this year. Because I think the big thing with Kokkonen is I think in his first year in North America, I don't think it's so much more of he's shown so much more this season with the Marlies than he did the previous year. I think it's that we saw what we saw in Finland again, but this time on North American ice, right? The big thing that we talked about that big rush of Finnish defensemen in kind of like the mid-late 2010s that really went in the first round, right? Ville Heinola comes to mind, Lassie Thompson comes to mind, a lot of highly touted Finnish defensemen. But if you look at that time span from 2014 until this past year, there's only been like 10 or 15 Finnish defensemen who have ever played an NHL game out of those draft classes, right? So it's not a huge success rate. And of those guys, I mean, Miro Heiskanen is the one that comes to mind, right? Like he was an anomaly. But then outside of that, Yoki Haru played really early on with Chicago, struggled, didn't get that opportunity to be an NHL regular until he went to Buffalo. And I think he's been fine, but he's probably like a number 5 on a team. And he's probably been the second best guy that's been produced out of Finland from those draft classes. And then everyone else, like, Mikkola, Välimäki, Vakanainen are the only guys that really come to mind, and Utivara. They've only played 2 or 3 seasons as consistent NHL regulars. And with Välimäki and Vakanainen, they didn't get there until the last 2 years, and they had to go to a different team to get that opportunity, right? So I think part of the struggle with not just Kokkonen in general, but Finnish defensemen coming to North America for the first time is finding that adjustment and that new style of play, right? Because when we saw Kokkonen in Liga, right? He'd been playing there for so many years. There were flashes of offensive potential. Right, where we saw there were some moments where if he had space and he had a numbers advantage where he could build speed into the neutral zone, he showed a willingness to really attack defenders and gain entries, right? And activating in the offensive zones and taking pucks behind the net and to find passes into the slot and centrally for his teammates, right? It was pretty rare to see him actually attack the middle of the ice himself, but there were promising signs that, hey, like this isn't just a guy who sits back and tries to be a bit of a, Twitter will love this term, cardio merchant, right? He just kind of kills the minutes he's on the ice and doesn't really contribute much offensively, right? Um, so we saw those kinds of flashes, right? But you have to keep in mind in the Finnish league that if you ever watch any international coverage of hockey, whether it's the World Juniors or the Holinka, whenever it's hosted overseas, what does every commentator say at the start of games? The ice surface is wider. There's so much more space for these players. But in Liga particularly, it's such a slow-paced game. It's a very slow-paced game, and so for a guy like Kokkonen, who's not naturally gifted physically and isn't an incredible skater, with that slower paced game and more space, it can mask a lot of those deficiencies where it doesn't seem like it's a huge glaring weakness. Like, yeah, he's not a great skater, but he's played great in Liga. He's a consistent, minute getter with them. He penalty kills for them, right? It's not an issue. Um, and a lot of these top prospects, Vakanainen comes to mind, Välimäki, they actually played in the USHL or the CHL in their draft year. So I'm not saying that it's not all necessarily on the Finnish Elite League's development system and their style of play that's causing this kind of difficulty in translation. But of that same 2014 to 2024 span, there's only been three guys, Heiskanen, Mikola, and Nutivara, who became NHL regulars at any point in the last 10 years, right? So I think that's like a huge part of it where, you know, when when he came to the AHL at first, I think number one, the big issue was that he wasn't guaranteed minutes, right? He was really a depth guy, and he was a guy that was going to have to rotate in and kind of earn his minutes. And the big thing with that is because of the the smaller rink surface, faster players, a much higher paced style of game. I think he really had difficulties, like any, international Finnish prospect, of adjusting to that kind of game. But on top of that, he really I think struggled with a lack of confidence, right? Where, because it's a new system. He's not guaranteed minutes, and he's playing in North America away from his family for the first time. I think there was a bit of a tentativeness to his game, and when so much of his game is about reading and reacting and trying to get ahead of the other team with his processor and anticipation instincts, he doesn't really have those great physical tools when he gets in trouble to bail himself out, right? Like with a guy like Badinka or one of these guys who are like 6'4", 6'5", it's okay if, they struggle a little bit early on because they have the frame to protect that puck and buy themselves some time. With a guy like Henry Muse, he's really highly touted this past year's draft class, and he fell because of inconsistencies, but when he handles pressure, he has the skating to as an outlet to get himself into space to make decisions, right? Whereas Kokkonen doesn't really have that. He really relies on reading the play, reading the pressure, and then getting it right the first time. And when you lack confidence, I think when you start second guessing that processor and those decisions that you're making, and that's such a core central part of his game, that when you're not decisive and you're not making those quick decisions, those physical shortcomings of not really being, an elite skater or a great passer or, huge and strong becomes very apparent, and then they flare up, and then that's when you get demoted and you can't find yourself in the lineup, and it kind of becomes a little bit of a snowball effect. And that's why I think that end of the season where he kind of stuck with the ECHL for a bit and then played that entire playoff run with the ECHL team was really positive for him, because it gave him that kind of stability in the lineup. It allowed him to kind of get up to speed with the game. And then I think he came to Traverse City and he came to training camp last year and he knocked it out of of the park because, like I was saying earlier, I don't think he showed anything that we'd never seen from him before. But I think what we saw flashes of in the Finnish Elite League and where we were hoping he could bring to the North American game, especially at Traverse City, he really brought it. Um, that calm and composed style. There was that there was a real shot in my mind when the Leafs were making their final cuts for training camp that, if we go into the season and someone gets hurt the first week of the year, Mikko Kokkonen could be the first guy that gets called up. Because if you remember, he had that nice goal against Montreal in the preseason and Simone Benoit, everyone was saying like, oh, he played for Anaheim. He's a terrible player. It turns out he was just dealing with a rib injury at the time, right? Like Kokkonen could have been the next guy up on the Leafs depth chart. And that really was, that followed was what that followed was his Traverse City appearance, where I thought he showed some real chemistry with Easton Cowan. And if you want to show chemistry with anybody on the Leafs roster at Traverse City, it probably would be Easton Cowan, right? And that instinctual ability of knowing when to jump in was like really highlighted. There was that one play where he saw that they had the numbers advantage. Dallas was caught on a bad change, and he jumped into the into the rush, and he got a tap in goal off of an Easton Cowan feed, right? And his composure really shined through. I think it was later in that game where Toronto won a puck battle, got him the puck on the left side of the ice all alone, and instead of just like skating it and shooting it on a goalie that was unscreened, he saw, traffic was coming on the right side, and he shot it in that direction for a redirection. It went off Cowan for a goal, right? And you see those kinds of instincts in Traverse City, and then you saw in preseason kind of that composure and that responsible defensive play, and you really went into the AHL season with a lot more confidence that what we saw in Liga could translate, and it's not one of those situations where he's just going to be a minute munching, net zero player. And it worked. That was the case. I saw a lot more of that willingness to activate and more comfort in carrying the puck out of the zone and getting entries and working in the offensive zone than I saw the previous year, right? Which is much more reminiscent of what we saw in the Finnish Elite League. So, he's still not a super deceptive player, very direct, but he makes it work for him, right? And I think it was really that confidence level and that opportunity of really adjusting to the North American game from the Finnish Elite League that allowed him to rebound the way he has this past season. Where I think if he plays well, there's a chance. There's a chance. I'm not saying it's a high chance, but there's a chance we see him more.
Yeah, and so you mentioned it there where he finishes the 22-23 season with the Newfoundland Growlers in the ECHL Kelly Cup playoffs. And he comes in last season in training camp and he sticks around a lot longer than people were expecting, gets praise from Sheldon Keefe, the head coach, of course, and gets in the mix as a legitimate recall option. And actually, we see him kind of get that NHL experience in the middle of the season as an emergency recall. Doesn't get into a game or anything like that, but gets on the roster for at least a day, gets in that warm-up group as a just-in-case type player. And if you don't have that kind of standout performance in training camp and make an impression with the head coach, he's probably not getting that opportunity later in the season as well. So unfortunately for Kokkonen, that goodwill now kind of goes by the wayside because it's a completely new coaching staff, with the exception of Mike Van Ryan, who was a defensive coach. So maybe there's a little bit that comes over there. But is it something where you feel like Kokkonen is probably going to have to replicate that kind of performance to get that goodwill back, or will some of that kind of carry over from last year?
I think I wouldn't say that he necessarily has to regain that goodwill. I think the people in the organization, Mike Van Ryan, as you mentioned, are very aware of what he brings to the table. They kind of know what kind of player he is. And I think with his coaching staff, he just has to come into camp and play his best hockey, right? Especially as a fringe player who's maybe AHL, maybe NHL. You can't really afford to rely on the coach liking you from last year, right? I think with Sheldon Keefe, even if Sheldon Keefe was still the head coach with the Leafs, he would still need to have a really strong camp to justify making an NHL roster, right? But I do think that with his style of play, it's something that Craig Berube and the coaching staff will appreciate, right? Especially with these kind of call-ups and fringe guys, what you really want to see is you don't need someone that's super flashy, right? You want to see someone who can come in a pinch, play his game and not get flustered too much with the NHL game and not lose you games. These fringe guys don't have to come in and wow you and win you games, but if there's left side, right side versatility, that's even better because it gives the coaching staff more options when they're trying to make lineups with key guys out. If he has experience playing on the penalty kill or power play, right, that's a positive too, right? A lot of coaches are talking nowadays, if you're playing on the bottom pair, you have to bring at least power play or penalty kill value, right? Otherwise, and Kokkonen has played a lot of minutes on the penalty kill for the Marlies. He's a very good defensive player at the AHL level. So if he can kind of continue that, I think that he's going to put himself in the best position to kind of make the team, right? The issue is obviously with some of the free agent moves and the moves the front office has made. Again, we
There's a lot
mentioned
of bodies. Yeah.
Kokkonen's is a Dubas holdover, right?
Yeah.
And Brad Treliving traded an actual draft pick to get the rights of Cade Weber. They brought back Mattinen, and even last year, a guy like Rafai got into NHL games before Kokkonen did, and I like Rafai a lot as well. The only reason I don't have a card for him is because he's obviously
He's too
graduated. He's a
old.
bit older. He's a bit older, right? But I think if anything, this new coaching staff will actually maybe even benefit him more because it is a clean sheet, right? Rafai doesn't have that edge. It's everybody on an even surface playing field trying to vie for that job. Because I do think Rafai did a very solid job during his call-up games with the Leafs last year. So if Sheldon Keefe was still the coach, maybe he would go, hey, we played Rafai for 2, 3 games last year. He was pretty good for us. This is a guy we can just call up without thinking twice. If injuries come up, right? With Berube, he hasn't really seen Rafai. He doesn't know what kind of positions he can play Rafai in. So I think there's going to be a bunch of guys vying for that spot. Rafai, Weber, Mattinen, Timmins, I guess, but I'm not sure if he has a role with this team
Yeah, he's
anymore.
he's a fascinating one. I don't know what's gonna happen there, but
But there's going to be a bunch of them vying for that last roster spot. And it's going to be really interesting to see who comes up on top.
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned kind of the new coach being kind of a con, but also a pro at the same time because yeah, all of these players have a clean slate. There's no baggage coming in. There's no preconceived notions. Everyone's starting at the same page for the most part with this coaching staff, and it's something that came up in my conversation earlier talking about Timothy Liljegren, for example, where Sheldon Keefe had literally been his head coach the entire time he'd been a professional player in North America from when he was 18, 19 years old in the AHL all the way through. And you kind of get an idea of what a player is in your mind. And that kind of sticks through. And it's not necessarily the case when it's a prospect like Mikko Kokkonen who's coming through. But at the same time, these head coaches, and especially somebody like Keefe and the relationship he had with somebody like Kyle Dubas, you're going to be involved in at least knowing who these players are. You're going to be involved in kind of watching their development as well. And you're going to get glimpses at them in training camp, where in the past you might have seen what Kokkonen was, or maybe had that preconceived notion of he's a few years away. And now you get this new coaching staff in here and they just kind of see what this 23-year-old kind of fringe NHL defenseman is. So I'm glad you mentioned that point as well, because it's something that I hadn't really thought of as well. I kind of just looked at it as a bit of a negative for Kokkonen coming into this camp, but you're right. It could definitely be a positive if he has that good camp once again. So looking ahead now to kind of what Kokkonen is, the thing that I always kind of come back to with him as a player is he's an average size defenseman at 6 foot, 200 pounds, and he doesn't have any elite traits. He's good at a lot of things, but he's not a plus player in the offensive zone for the most part. He's a good defender, and it's kind of like, how much of that can you be to be a legitimate NHL player? And obviously, he's got this kind of third pairing projection at this point, so you don't necessarily have to be a world beater that gets up to a first or second pairing by any means. But does he have enough of those good, not great traits to become that third pairing depth guy at the NHL level?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because even as a guy who's has Kokkonen listed as one of my guys, my projection for him is still a seventh defenseman at the NHL level, right? So it's like a little bit of an oxymoron. Do you like him? Do you not? I think with a player like Kokkonen, there's always going to be questions about NHL translatability, right? And we saw as I was talking about some of those that Liga version of Kokkonen this past season where there's some stuff offensively with that newfound confidence, but the question is, can that translate at the NHL level? Can he do what he did at Traverse City and for the Marlies? Can he do it in the NHL? And to be honest, to be frank, as much as I like him, I find it hard pressed to project that with confidence, right? I didn't really see it in preseason last year, right? When he got into preseason games, it was much more of the old
Yeah.
Mikko Kokkonen, not so much trying to jump into plays. I think he was more scared of making the big mistake. And you know, he chooses when he wants to attack really well, right? Like that's kind of the thing with his hockey mind. But the physical traits is just he doesn't have the skating, he doesn't have those great hands, and I'm just not sure that he's going to be able to do what he does against AHL guys and prospects who are like 17, 18 years old against, more physical and faster NHL players, right? A lot of his moves are him catching defenders off guard on the rush and kind of making one or two moves to get past them, and then he either just shoots it on net, cross creases it, or just pulls back and cycles the puck back to the point, right? It's very, as I said, it's kind of like clockwork, right? The way that he kind of approaches the offensive game. And there's more layers to his game than, say a Simone Benoit, but, who kind of just flies down the wing, dumps it in, or it flies down the wing and shoots it, right? There's a little bit more to Kokonen's offensive rush game than that, but I don't think that because I don't think he's going to be able to translate that kind of skill set to the NHL level on a consistent basis. And as a result, I don't think that difference between him and Benoit is going to be super, distinctive, right? Like you're not really going to be able to see Koken do more of the stuff compared to Benoit just because he doesn't have the physical size or speed or hands to do it consistently, I don't think, against NHLers, right? Another concern is, like we've been mentioning, that heavy stride, right? The acceleration is not great. It's not great. He's got some good contact balance and knee bend. He's stocky and he's strong, so he takes contact really well. And offensively, when he gets going, at higher speeds, right, he has the opportunity to build up speed. He can be shifty, right? But that kind of change of direction and shiftiness doesn't really translate defensively when you're following the opponent and you're not dictating the pace and the direction, right? And you're kind of working almost off of a standstill at times, right? And that's when that lack of acceleration really comes into play. And he offsets that, right? Like he's very well aware that he doesn't have the acceleration, that change of direction to be able to match players. So he when he's tracking forwards from, down low up to the blue line, he's always going to leave a little bit of a gap. He's not going to be a guy who closes the space really quickly. But he uses an active stick, right? He's really active with his stick. It's always moving. He's always trying to, lift the stick. He's always trying to get to the puck. And he leaves a cushion when he's guarding players out, right? And his kind of mentality is, look, I'm not going to be able to keep up with you on every play, but I'm going to try to figure out where you're going, and I'm going to try to beat you to the spot, right? And he tries to win those defensive battles, right? The issue is, he is prone sometimes to get caught, right? When so much of your game is just anticipating and trying to beat guys to the spot, and you're not, constantly applying, close pressure, stutter steps, shoulder fakes, like they can get him where, he's suddenly a little bit out of position. He kind of has to work really hard to get back to the player. But I think there are merits though, right? Like he's aware of these weaknesses and he's kind of adjusting his game to kind of mask them the best that he can. And even with those kind of agility concerns, he's been relied heavily this year, as I've mentioned, by the Marlies in end of game situations, penalty kill, any defensive zone faceoffs, right? Um, and when he's defending in transition, like he uses his anticipation so well. Like the four-way skating isn't great, right? But he can read plays as, a defender's trying to break it out, and he jumps and tries to take away those passing lanes with that anticipation. And, he again, he really struggles to close gaps, right? On odd man rushes, right? With guys flying down the wing. And that's going to be a concern because if that guy's Connor McDavid, you're in a little bit of trouble there, right? But, he offsets that by playing more centrally, right? By giving the winger or the forward more room, a bit of a cushion like he does when he defends them, in zone, right? And that cushion allows him to kind of cut off opponents before they get to those quality scoring opportunities, right? So again, his game defensively is all about kind of restricting those high danger opportunities. And, I think NHL coaches can appreciate that, right? I think a lot of coaches be like, I don't mind a shot from, 10, 15 feet out, right? Or from the point, right? It's the slot chances that we're really concerned about. If we have a good goalie, ideally he makes those saves, right? Um, but like I said, even with the glaring weaknesses, I love his adjustment. He really masks those kinds of weaknesses and maximizes, what he's really good at. And, are we going to see an everyday NHLer out of Kokkonen? Probably not, right? There's a reason he's a seventh guy for me, but I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that his smarts and his instincts and kind of that responsible play of the responsible style of play where he's always making sure that he makes the right decision. I think there's a chance those skill sets translates well. And, on one of these teams, maybe it's not with the Leafs, but with some NHL team, he'll be able to stick around as a sixth defender, right? If you pair him with someone who's more offensively inclined, or you're a team that just wants your third pair to kill minutes, right? Before you can get the big guns back out. So, I think most likely, no. He doesn't have that NHL ceiling, but I think that there's enough there where it's still possible. It's not likely, but it's possible.
Yeah, and so talking about that possibility, what would you consider the biggest strength to Kokonen's game? What is the kind of standout trait to his game that could make him an NHLer if he kind of does reach that point?
It's got to be those pro habits. He's played pro hockey for so long. He was playing in the Liga in his draft year -1, like before
Yeah,
his draft year even, right?
I
You
think he
know,
was literally the youngest defenseman in Liga history, either still or at one point. I don't know if Aaron Kiviharju maybe broke that or something. I'll see if I can find anything on that.
yeah,
But at one
maybe.
point, he was definitely the youngest in league history.
Yeah, like he had like 7 years of pro experience before he came to North America, right? Those pro habits, like you can really see them even here in North America, right? He's 6 feet tall, but he's strong. He knows how to take contact, and make plays through contact. Very efficient and simplified game, right? He reads pressure super well. On recoveries, when he reads pressure, he's always scanning and he'll diagnose the best option to go with the puck, right? If he has space, he'll recover and settle it down before looking to make a breakout pass. If he's under pressure, he'll rim around the boards, the opposite direction of pressure, right? Making the safe play, right? And with that in mind, you'll rarely see him try to toss a puck up the middle when he's under pressure, right? Like I love both of these guys, Jake Gardiner and Connor Timmins. I love both of them, but you can see sometimes when these guys get pressured, their first instinct is to get the puck off, right? And they're expecting a forward to drop back into the slot to pick up after them, and the forward's not there, right? With Kokkonen, he doesn't even try that. He doesn't want to guess if there's a guy there. If he doesn't know there's a guy there to cover him to get the puck to, he's just gonna ring it around the boards to his defensive partner. Live to fight another day, right? Another couple of seconds, right? Um, and that body that we mentioned, like, it's not a strength, but because he's got a low center of gravity and he's stocky and really and pretty heavy for a 6 foot guy, he absorbs contact really well. So he shields the puck really well until he can, and he'll just hold it there, right? Until his teammates can come in, right? So it's that low event game, right? And another thing that I really love about his game is how, on breakouts, right? He's always looking to put himself in a position where his teammates can find him, right? Make himself available to his teammates. And that's something I think the Leafs could improve on a little bit, right? And just in terms of supporting their defensemen, supporting their teammates during breakouts, right? Um, and he's a really direct player. He's always trying to throw it up the wing to a teammate if he's there, or he'll carry it and he'll dump it in, right? Very safe, very simplified. Unless he has the numbers advantage, right? Like I mentioned, then he's more willing to kind of take risks. And I like his first pass. He's not going to be Evan Bouchard, who's going to be able to rifle one from his red line to the opponent blue line, but he can make that first pass. It's a efficient, good first pass. And I think the last thing that is by far my favorite part of his defensive game is just the scanning habits. He's never caught puck watching and leaving a man open back door, right? If he's on the weak side, he's always scanning over his shoulder, checking to see if someone's trying to sneak into the slot or sneak in back door. Um, and that's why I say when I say he's a really intelligent defenseman, he's always downloading data. He's always looking. It's almost like a football quarterback. He's always looking. He's always trying to gather information from around the ice, and then he adjusts depending on what he sees, right? In transition, he's always looking at what options the opposing team coming has, and then he tries to break up that play, right? Whether that's cutting the puck off at the blue line, intercepting it, or laying out TJ Brody style and blocking the cross crease. It's all about anticipation, and it works for him because he's always looking. He's always aware of what's happening around him. Whereas I think for a lot of more talented defensemen, they don't have those kinds of habits, and they'll often look like a headless chicken running around on the ice, right? They're just looking for a body, right? Not really knowing why or what the reason they're doing it is. So pro habits, scanning, responsible, efficient, those are really positive traits to have in an NHL defenseman.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, of course, we got to talk about the weaknesses and some of the things that could prevent him from becoming that NHL defenseman. He has those pro habits. He has the things that the coaches like. That's why we saw some of the love from Sheldon Keefe at the end of training camp and preseason last year, where he stuck around pretty long. But ultimately, he didn't get into any of those NHL games last year. They used a lot of defensemen. He wasn't one of those call ups. What is kind of the key areas that you see as the things for him to still develop on, and kind of the key weaknesses that could prevent him from becoming an NHLer?
Yeah, it's players like these who I'm like a fan of where I really wish Barbara Underhill was still working for the Leafs. Like if we could just lock those two in the rink for like 2 months, I feel like by the time Kokkonen comes out of that, like his projection will be completely different. Because I think with a defenseman of his ilk, you need two things. You really need to either be able to skate really well or you need to be really, really big. If you're not going
Yeah.
to be a great skater, you got to be really, really big, and you got to be able to have that wingspan to challenge defenders, right? Like if you're going to give a cushion at the NHL level, you need the wingspan to still be able to stick check effectively and make the forward uncomfortable. Whereas with Kokkonen, he doesn't have that's never going to change, right? He's never going to, unless there's like a transplant in the future that allows him to become 6'3" and like make his arms longer. Like he's never gonna be Eric Branson size, right? Or Logan Stanley sized. The skating just gotta come around. He's gotta be better in straight lines. He's gotta be sharper on his edges, tighter on his edges. He's gotta be able to change direction, and really have much better four directional skating. I think that's the big thing. I don't think he has to be a blazer in straight lines because a lot of defensemen, even elite offensive defensemen, like Quinn Hughes, I don't think is a burner, right? But he's so smooth on his edges. He can always turn and twist and turn whenever he needs to create space for himself because other players can't do that, right? Evan Bouchard wasn't the greatest skater heading into his first season after being drafted, right? It was something he worked on, and he's not a great skater still, but it's good enough, right? I think for Kokkonen, the big thing is the skating. Like if his skating can come together, like there's no reason why he can't be like a Marshall Rafai because I think that's the main distinction point between them. I think Kokkonen has the better instincts and the better like pro habits drilled into him to play at the NHL level compared to Rafai. But Rafai is like 6'2", 6'3", and he's a great skater at his size, right? If Kokkonen can be a good to above average skater, I think those habits, like that's when you start getting into that Brett Kulak comparison that I was talking about on my prospect card, right? Like Brett Kulak's one of the best third pair defensemen in the NHL, right? And he can play second pair in a pinch if need be. And he's not exceptional at anything, right? The way that Kokkonen is not exceptional at anything, but he's got great defensive instincts and he skates really well, even though he's slightly undersized. So I think it's the skating. If Kokkonen can really improve that skating, which I'm not super sure that he can, but if he can, that's a huge difference maker for his NHL projection.
Yeah, and as we wrap up here, this upcoming season is going to be a big one. He's 23. He's going to be turning 24 in the middle part of the season. Been in North America now for a couple of years. This will be his third season, primarily playing in the organization with the Marlies. It's kind of at that point now as a 2019 draft pick where it's like you either show something or you're never going to show it. What are your expectations for Kokkonen this season?
I think that with Mikko Kokkonen, he's going to be a steady top four defenseman for the Marlies for sure all
Yep.
year long. I think even with the guys they added to the Marlies, I think the familiarity with the system, how well he played last year, he's going to be a mainstay there. Um, and he's going to play big penalty kill minutes for them. But I think he might get one or two games. I think he might just because Toronto signed a couple old guys on the back end with OEL and Tanev, and Tanev basically hasn't played a full NHL season in his career as much as I love him. So it's almost a given that number seven on the depth chart is going to come and play games for the Leafs at some point this year to replace Tanev. Um, I don't. I'm sure you're going to have a video for Connor Timmins with somebody or yourself, later on in this series. But I don't think Connor Timmins is a guy who Toronto really sees a long-term future for. I think they've given him
Yeah,
more than
I
enough
don't even know if
opportunities.
he's on the roster on day one. Like, I
Yeah,
don't know what's gonna happen with him, but
yeah, like that's a like they can offload him for a minimum deal. Like that's not an insig because he's making like 1.3. Like that's not an insignificant amount of money that we're paying him on the cap. So, you know, if he's gone, that's one less person that he has to fight with. But I think his ability to play the offside, he showed it for a full season with the Marlies. I think that's something that'll be an advantage for him because Cade Weber, Mattinen, those aren't guys who can play on their offsides, right? So that might be something that helps him. I think he might catch one or two games just because the Leafs cannot afford to lose games in the regular season. We every year they finish third or third in the third in the Atlantic Division. They always have to go on the road, and it's like it's never a great feeling to have to start your playoff series on the road, right? I think they really don't want to lose regular season games. And I think Kokinen will be able to provide that high floor where he won't be the reason you lose games. But on top of that, I think if you're Toronto, you owe it to yourselves as a guy who you drafted in 2019. You've had him in your development room for 5 years now, 2 years directly in North America. I think you owe it to yourselves to see what you have in him before you just let him go. Um, and he's gonna lose his waiver exemption, I think, this season. Um,
yeah, after this season, so he doesn't need waivers this fall, but he will beginning in 2024
yeah, I
or
think it's
2025. Sorry, I
Yeah,
don't know
it's
when.
imperative that you see what you have in him before, because the worst case scenario that you could have is you block him all year with Dakota Mermis and Simone Benoit and OEL. He never plays a single game, and then all of a sudden next year you have a rash of injuries. You need to play him. He steps in, plays like a 6 game stretch, and he's really good. And then you go, wow. But then the guys come back from injury and you go, he's good, but he's not like we don't know if it's just a 6 game stretch or if he's really going to be able to do this at the NHL level. It's like we had to send him back down, but now he's not waiver exempt. And a team like Anaheim is like, hey, like they did with William Lagesson last year. They're like, hey, we need an extra body on the blue line, and then they claim him, right? And then all of a sudden you've lost this guy who had a strong showing for 6 games. You lost him for nothing because you didn't figure out beforehand what he could be, right? I think the Leafs owe it to themselves if they have the opportunity at some point this season to give him a shot. It doesn't have to be an extended look. It could just be 2 games, right? But you owe it to yourselves to see what you have because, if that situation that I mentioned happens next season, right? At least now he played really well the last time we called him up in 2024, 2025. He's been great 3 training camps in a row. Like maybe he's just good enough to be a sixth defenseman. And then you make a move and you send somebody else down, right? Like at least you have more clarity before you have to make that decision on whether you just let him leave your organization for nothing. So yeah, I think he'll get a game or two this year. I'm hoping at least. But he's realistically going to spend pretty much the entire season on the Marlies unless something goes catastrophically wrong for the Leafs.
Yeah, I definitely could see an NHL debut coming this season, just given kind of his place on the depth chart. And in recent seasons, we've seen the Leafs use like 11, 12, even 13 defensemen in certain seasons. I'd probably put him around the number 10 on the depth chart coming into the season. I think it mainly comes down to whether they want Dakota Mermis to be that kind of Logan Shaw type on the Marlies roster where you could use him if you needed to, but they kind of want him to be a guy that's always on the Marlies as kind of that veteran presence. He's been a captain in the AHL before. I think if he's somebody that factors in on the NHL roster, that pushes him down further. But I could absolutely see a scenario where, say, a Simone Benoit type is unavailable, or Ekman Larson is probably more likely a player that could be unavailable at some point this season. You need somebody to step into the lineup, Phil Myers is a right shot defenseman. He could come in because McCabe is probably a left-right split, but Kokkonen can also play both sides. That's somebody that could step in. And then it's basically you're comparing to Marshall Rafai or Cade Weber. And Rafai is probably the guy that gets called up in that situation. And I think Cade Weber is best suited to play kind of the AHL season and develop in that way rather than kind of the fringe NHLer that some people are projecting him to be. But definitely Kokkonen is in the mix with all those guys. And it comes back to the same thing that we saw last year, where after a season that was pretty disappointing, he comes into training camp and he looks like a completely different player. And if he does that again this year, building off of what he did last year, then we're talking about somebody who could legitimately be a depth NHLer. And obviously that would be great to see. At this point, is most likely kind of is what he is to a certain extent as a top 4 AHL option who can step in a pinch. But it'll be fascinating to see somebody, as I mentioned earlier, I've been up and down on over his time in the Leafs organization, and I still, after what, like 6 something like that years in the Leafs organization, I still don't really know what to completely think of him for his NHL potential. But Ryan, this has been a great chat. Thanks so much for jumping on here. Let the people know where we can find your work and plug anything if you have anything.
Yeah, no. My Twitter page is Ryan Moss Scouting. Do a lot of player cards. I'm trying to, expand my library to also include other teams, but I'm a Leafs fan first. Leafs Nation is always going to come first. So, I'm working on finishing, John Fusco and kind of the lower end prospects in the Leafs system first. 2025 draft coverage. If you're interested in that, I've been delving into that really early this year. I already have my top 32, maybe a 2-rounder the next time I post it. So we're making some progress there. Shout out to my boys over at the Tundra Cast. That's our podcast. Small podcast, but we have fun with it. I think we do really great content. So that's just at Tundra Cast Pod on Twitter if you guys want to throw a follow. But once again, thank you so much, Kyle, for inviting me on. It's been a great talk. And a prospect nerd like me, like this is a dream, just being able to come on and talk about
we
a
don't need
niche
to go
prospect.
that crazy. I
Hey,
love it. No, it's been great having you on, Ryan, and be sure to check out all of his work on Twitter. Like I told him earlier on before we started recording, I invited him on because I saw one of those player cards. A lot of great info on there, as you mentioned, a lot of Leaf stuff in particular for this kind of fan base, but a lot of stuff coming for general fan base as well with some of the draft coverage you got coming on. Ryan, you're one of the great up and comers. It was good to connect here and chat about Mikko Kokkonen, and we'll definitely connect again in the future. Thanks for jumping on.
For sure. Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of Camp Countdown. Thanks again to Ryan for jumping on the show. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already, be sure to check out previous episodes of the show, and we'll be back soon for more Camp Countdown. See you then.